What's up, everybody? I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came out to the screenings. We had an amazing run. It was a blast. Stay tuned for more announcements in the coming months. We will have more announcements for the movie Left at Wall. It's going to be available to everybody really, really soon. Can't share much more now, but we'll have more soon. But just wanted to say thank you to everyone who came out to the screenings, all the cast and crew, everybody who made this project possible. I'll be saying a lot more in the coming months, but for now, thank you, thank you, thank you. Episode 42, Margaret Killjoy. Margaret Killjoy is an author, podcaster, and musician. She has brilliant insights, especially on the topics of anarchy and history. Her video series, Live Like the World is Dying, details her experiences living off-grid. It's informative, insightful, brutally honest, and, when appropriate, hilarious. I've been a fan of hers for a few years now and was stoked to finally get to talk to her. Please welcome to the show, Margaret Killjoy. Margaret Killjoy, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. There's a heat dome over my house, but other than that, I'm okay.
Are you amidst the heat wave that's going on? Is that the part of the country you're in?
Yeah, hopefully by the time y'all listen, it'll be over, but I'm not convinced it will be.
Yeah. It's been the whole week, right?
Yeah.
So I want to start pretty basic, if that's okay. I follow the YouTube channel, and I also listen to your podcast, Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff, which I've learned a lot about different things. I mean, even things related to my hometown. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I had no idea about the EMT situation or the ambulance.
Oh,
situation. Yeah. That blew my mind. I had no idea about any of that.
Yeah, and it was only like 50 years ago.
Right?
Yeah.
I
had no idea either.
Yeah. So how would you describe what you do?
I think at like the core of it, I see myself as a writer. I write fiction and I write nonfiction. I write essays, and I've been doing podcasting for a while. And some of my podcasts are a little bit more, interview based. And I run a community preparedness podcast called Live Like the World is Dying. But my literal day job is that I run a history podcast called Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. And I basically am trying to show that whenever there's bad things, there's people who fight against those things. And so I try to tell radical history in a way that isn't boring. Like there's this unfortunate problem where a lot of history books are really boring because they're written for other academic researchers, which isn't a perfectly valid thing for them to be, but it doesn't necessarily tell a story in a way that necessarily brings in readers. And so I kind of, coming from more of a fiction telling background, it's been an interesting transition. And so I do those things. And then I also play music, and I don't know, I used to make my living selling jewelry on Etsy, and I do weird creative crap. And that's what I've been doing for a very long time.
Do you make the jewelry, or did you?
Mm-hmm. I used to, yeah. I was actually just complaining to my friend today about how I haven't made jewelry in years and how I kind of miss it, but there's only so much time in the day. So
I want to talk about anarchism. What does that mean to you? Do you still identify as an anarchist?
Yeah. I identify as an anarchist. I have since 2002. Unlike most people, I have like a date, February 2nd, 2002. I went to a demonstration in New York City, and I was really impressed with the anarchists. I went up to someone and I said, who was wearing all black and a mask. And I said, what's anarchism? And he said to me, well, we hate both capitalism and the state. And that kind of blew my mind on its own anyway, because I came up, I grew up like tail end of the Cold War and stuff like that. Right. And so I had always been presented that you either have communism or capitalism. Those are your only options. And I felt really lackluster about any of the options that were presented to me prior to that. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, we're going to build up alternative institutions while attacking the ones that are destroying the world. And I was like, oh, do you have an extra black mask? And he was like, yeah, I need an extra black mask. And he gave it to me. And I was like, I'm an anarchist now. And my politics have deepened and developed from then. And I certainly don't think there's a dress code to anarchism. I was already a goth, so I continue to be a goth, right? But that doesn't have anything, subculture and anarchism are entirely separate. Now I understand anarchism to be a social movement and or ideology or sort of anti-ideology that has been part of anti-capitalism since the beginning of capitalism. Basically, the development of socialism that happened a lot in the mid-19th century that was a response to the growth of capitalism. A lot of the earliest socialists were anarchists, and prior to the 1917 coup by the Bolsheviks against all the other pluralistic anti-capitalist groups, from my perspective, anarchism was a very, not necessarily predominant, but a very dominant strain of socialism, and a very common and popular method with which to attack the capitalist institutions that were immiserating people. And so I see myself in that lineage, and I'm proud to do so. But I also, at the end of the day, one of the things that I care about is that anarchists have historically cared about pluralistic revolution, where we're not trying to make everyone else be us. We're simply trying to make other people not tell us that we have to be Bolsheviks or whatever. I have this unfortunate problem because I do a history podcast for a living. I now kind of live in the past a little bit. And for the first 10, 15 years I was an anarchist, I would have hated that, because absolutely it was a set of practices built around direct action and solidarity and mutual aid. Those are the jargon words that we'll maybe throw around the most. Direct action being, if there's a problem, you directly address it. You do not wait for an intermediary. You don't go beg politicians to fix a problem. You gather up as many people as necessary. You build mass actions as we need to, and directly confront the forces that are destroying the world. And then solidarity is more about how we can all be different, right? We don't have to all be the same. We can still hold on to cultural identifiers and things like that make us distinct. But then what we have to do is have solidarity across different cultural norms and different methods of doing things. And then mutual aid is kind of what we hope to build society on. And mutual aid, has been used by a lot of different people as jargon or slogan or very useful practice. But it's basically, we take care of each other, and we take care of each other in a horizontal way as compared to a top down, doling out, everyone gets one slice of bread. But instead it's we all get together and share, but no one's forcing it. No one's, making us do that or whatever. So yeah, I'm still an anarchist. I get more and more of an anarchist as the time goes on, although it tempers. I'm no longer as to hell with you, you're not an anarchist, you're trash or whatever. I don't know. I never said that, but I see why people make different compromises as I get older and things like that. But more and more at the end of the day, everything I see in my life reminds me that probably I'm in charge of myself, and probably that means that I should be as responsible as possible, and responsible interdependently with other people.
So given your answer, what is kind of your assessment on ANCAPs and stuff like that?
I don't know y'all's usual audience. I would not. Okay, I'm a big tent anarchist in that I believe a lot of different types of anarchism are valid. I do not believe anarcho-capitalism is particularly related to anarchism, and I am bitter that they use that word. There was a conscious effort. I can't remember who has the quote off the top of my head. There was a conscious effort in the early 20th century to take the word libertarian. The word libertarian meant anarchist in a lot of parts of the world. It still does, because we were attempting to distinguish ourselves from authoritarian socialism, like the more Marxist strain that developed into Lenin and Stalin and things like that. There was a libertarian socialism, an anti-state socialism, and that was a very common word. And then there's, again, you can look it up, but there's a quote that's today we have scored a great victory and taken a word from our ideological opponents and taken the word libertarian. And I feel like they've kind of kept going and now attempt to take anarchism. And I get why you can have that idea, right? Because on some level, capitalism, it at least says that it respects the individual more than state communism, right? It says, well, everyone can keep the products of their labor, and only they can actually, because capitalism is the system by which we extract the products of people's labor. But it unfortunately causes a lot of messiness, right? Because some people are attracted towards it, because there's also a misunderstanding. Sorry to just go really heady right away, but
no, please.
there's a misunderstanding, I think, that people have about what capitalism is, for example, where capitalism, people tend to view capitalism as that's where you work for your money and then you spend your money on things, right? As compared to like waiting in the bread line. That's how people kind of imagine this difference, I think. And I would argue that capitalism is absolutely not defined by money or wage or like work, right? It's not about working for money. That does not make capitalism. We had that for thousands of years. We've also had other economic systems blurrily all throughout time. Capitalism, I think the key here is in the word capital. It's the idea to make money, with capital. And the way in which you do that is you extract the value that other people produce, or that nature produces, but that gets into complicated other stuff. Let's stick with like, if you hire someone to do something, right? And that can be a free arrangement, right? But at the end of the day, if you don't get extra out of what you hired them to do, like if they pick an apple and you're not able to sell the apple for more than their wage, you won't bother hiring them. So you, at that point, you are now the capitalist. And the thing that defines it is not the work you have done, but instead the money that you make off of what other people have done. And I think because people misunderstand that, people are often like, well, I don't hate markets and I like working for myself and I like, these sorts of things. And I would argue that that's not inherently capitalism, and that anti-capitalism includes a broad spectrum of economic ideas. And it doesn't include anarcho-capitalism because I believe that having someone who systematically extracts your value, it also puts you in a position where you're not fully free if you are a wage laborer, because if you can quit your job, but you'll starve, So I see anarcho-capitalism as I am opposed to it. I don't know the makeup of your general audience, but that is where I'm at on it.
They're in agreement.
Okay.
Yeah. I agree with everything you just said, and I think you put it very, very well, especially some of the myths of capitalism, because we all encounter those cliches. Yeah. I'm sure you encounter this as a musician. I encounter this as a comedian. Well, Ron, how could you say you're an anti-capitalist when someone has to buy a ticket to see your show? And it's, I wish I could just play the past 2 minutes of what you said to that person. Be like, look, this explains it really well. You're totally missing the points.
No, I think about that all the time because I sell books, right? And I go table and, I give stuff away when I can, right? But it's like, well, you need to have people pay to come see comedy because comedy is work and you are entertaining people and you are doing something that adds value and you should be able to live off of it, Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about your off-grid living. I've watched some of those videos you've made. My first question, and I want to preface this by saying, Margaret, I'm the type of guy, if it's more elaborate than duct tape, I'm out. I'm not handy when it comes to growing food. My neighbor, who is an urban gardener professionally, gave me a tomato plant, and he said, Ron, nobody would manage to F up this tomato plant.
Oh, did you kill it?
I killed it. I got zero. I got nothing. I don't have a green thumb to save my life. So that's the preface for this next question. But how did you learn all of these skills? You know about plumbing. You know about you have some electrician skills. How do you do all this? You make jewelry. I didn't know that about you. And so where did you kind of pick up all these skills?
Okay, so to preface it, I currently don't live off grid. I do live rurally, and I still use a lot of those same skills. Actually, I just came in from working in my garage on building shelves for my pantry that I've suddenly changed how I designed, and I'm working on engineering a weird system where cans roll in my pantry and whatever. But I did live for years off grid. I lived. I didn't start off with any of those skills. I had the tiniest bit of it, right? My dad's very handy. Some of my earliest memories are him putting a handsaw on my hand and me cutting a 2x4 while he built a playhouse in the backyard. So I did have, shout out to my dad who taught me a lot of these things. He used to be a professional welder. And now he just does wood carving of strange abstract things in his retirement. And but I learned it because I kind of had to. I moved out to this off-grid land project. I had been living in a van forever. Actually, the first woodworking project I did was I built out my van because I'd been living in it for years, and not out of a cool, romantic tiny house thing. I didn't have any money. I was a full-time activist, and I was trying to make a living as a writer, and that is hard to break into. And so I just lived in a van, and I was sick of living in a weird carpet van, because it wasn't a van life van. It was just a van, And then I ripped everything out and I borrowed tools from some other punks and I built it, and I did a terrible job, but it was enough. And one of the things that's cool about a lot of handiwork stuff, there's a level where you can be professional at something, and then there's a level where you can do something that's good enough for you. And they're vastly different. I didn't know about how to stain things before you assemble them. Right? So there's like weird stain marks everywhere and little spots I missed and things like that. And the screws weren't flush, and, and there's like a lot of things that like slowly would break and I'd have to fix them. And so that was the first thing. But then I just like continued to live off grid. I lived in a barn for a long time. That's how I taught myself solar. I was like, well, I want electricity and there's no power here. So I guess I'm going to buy these solar panels. And then I watched YouTube and I was like, well, how do I put this together? And the first time okay, when you imagine a car battery, does it kind of scare you because it's full of electricity?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the first time I built a solar panel, I didn't have enough money for like a nice lithium battery. And so I basically had a car battery that I was hooked up to. And I was terrified as I was inching closer to it to screw the, bolt onto it or whatever. And then my friend who was a mechanic came over and just basically put his hands on both terminals of the battery. It's fine. You have to really try for a 12-volt battery to hurt you. And that includes giant 12-volt batteries, like car batteries or larger. I had an industrial solar battery for a while that was a repurposed battery that had been like by the side of the road for a road sign, the kind that has a solar panel on it. And you can't hurt yourself with it. Whoever's listening, I'm sure you can find out a way to hurt yourself with it. But it's not electricity. Like even if you drop your wrench between the two poles, it's not that the electricity will then hurt you. It's that it'll heat up so much that it'll hurt you. And so a lot of it is less scary. Okay, there's some stuff that's scary. Don't mess with the table saw until you know what you're doing. That one's scary. And then I wanted to build a cabin. So I went out and I built a cabin. And I didn't know what I was doing, and I made all kinds of mistakes. And the house lasted the 3 years that I lived in it, and it probably still exists. Someone bought that property, and I don't know what happened to it. I hope it's on Airbnb now, but it might be. And and I just built it, and I had friends around, right? I lived on this off-grid property, and so the other people were much better at building, and I'm the idiot who doesn't know anything. And I'm like, how does the circular saw work or whatever, And I just slowly learned. And then if you build an A-frame, which is a really easy house to build, it's an incredibly hard house to put furniture in because you have to hand make every piece of furniture because it's not straight, right? There's no straight wall to put anything up against. Besides the front and back wall, but usually that's a door and a window. And so, yeah, I just taught myself slowly. And the same, actually, I'm doing the same with gardening right now. Where I lived off grid before, I was in the woods and I didn't have a good garden spot. And now I have a pretty good garden spot, but I've been avoiding it because I think to myself, I kill every plant I touch, right? And the first year I killed some plants and I also harvested some lettuce, and then some cherry tomatoes actually also. And then last year I had a ton of basil and everything else died. And this year it's a little bit better. And by next year, I think I'm going to be growing a bunch of vegetables. I believe in you, is what I'm saying. You just have to kill a lot of plants on the way.
All right. I just got to, I'm already, I think 4 and counting. So, but yeah, I'm not going to give up. So you talk about in your video how off-grid living is not kind of a long-term solution for everyone, and I really appreciated the way you explained it. But could you kind of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So there's this thing that for example, when I was talking about living in a van, people are like, "Oh, I wish I lived in a van." No, you don't. You don't wish you lived in a van. You might wish you lived in a van, but if you lived in a van, you'd be like, "Oh, I miss my apartment." right? There's a reason we have, and there are exceptions to this. Some people will be happier in a tiny home, but overall, there's a reason that people have developed these things, and we've done so unsustainably. There's some serious problems, like the fact that I'm in this horrible heat dome right now is directly related to the way we as a human species have solved, or Western civilization have solved some problems over the past couple hundred years. But being able to wash your clothes every day, or change clothes every day, if you live in an incredibly humid area, for example, I lived in the South when this was happening, it makes an incredible difference to your health long-term, right? Most people could probably survive a year or two where they're just like, whatever, I'm just sweaty and wear the same shirt every day, And then eventually it's your body's not going to put up with it anymore. And I think that carries across a lot of different aspects of life. Everything is work when you live off-grid. Everything you want to do. When the pandemic started, because I built my off-grid cabin before the pandemic and moved into it about 6 months before the pandemic. And for me, it was just a bedroom. I had an office in town that I did most of my writing and running my Etsy shop and my Patreon where I would send out zines and things, But I would come home at night to this beautiful cabin in the woods and go to sleep. And so that is fine. But that's not truly off-grid living because I'm entirely dependent upon the grid and I just drive 20 minutes into town every day, right? And then the pandemic happened and we didn't know what was happening and I stayed in my cabin. And then all of a sudden my cabin had to be my everything instead of my bedroom. So I'm in this 12 by 12 space. And at the start of it, I had no solar. I had some of those skills. I had built the solar in the previous, the barn I'd been living in. And I went through one by one and I taught myself enough plumbing to start getting water into a sink in my house. And I started, and it was, I didn't have hot water. By the end, I had hot water on a shower on my porch that was heated by a propane tank. And I just had to kind of painstakingly learn one thing after the other. And then everything would break because I'm not an everything expert. I am a jack of all trades. And so the first 3 times you build a plumbing system, you're going to mess it up. And it'll work for a little while. So you'll think you have succeeded and then it'll fail and then you'll be really frustrated. I filled my house with propane once because I had been building this, I took a camp stove, a propane camp stove, and hosed it up to a propane tank that was outside. I was smart enough to put my propane tank outside. But it turns out that camp stove wasn't rated to have constant pressure on it. And so one day I'm just sitting there and all of a sudden my cabin started filling with propane and I had to flee the house. And I didn't know enough about propane to know how to safely deal with this, right? So I threw on a gas mask, I put a fan in the door, and then I hid in this 40-degree rain. I hid in my little tent of a shed that was next to my cabin and called my friends who then talked me through it and they knew about propane and they were like, hey, you're okay. You can go back to your house in a little bit. It's not going to blow up. It's not safe. You got to wait, and then 3 stoves later, I had a working stove. And so if you know all of this stuff, off-grid life can be great, especially if you have a bunch of money. If you have a bunch of money, you can have the things that are as good as on-grid. But so many people, one by one, would move out to this land project I lived on, and they'd stick around for a year or two, and then they would leave. And they would come out idealistically thinking about, oh, off-grid life is so great. And I would be like, hey, do you want help setting up solar and a shower? And they'd be like, no, I don't need any of that, But you do. Or rather, we're all spoiled and we like having those things. So, I don't know. But there is still something beautiful and romantic about it. I lay in bed sometimes and I'm like, I wish I was sleeping in my van, because it's simpler. Because I'm when I lived in my van, I wasn't worried about, I don't know, did I put all my dishes away? Or how am I going to deal with the mold problem in the basement I go into every now and then? Or, I think simple life is great. I just think that simple life on grid. And then in terms of the actual solution societally, we tend to think about off-grid life as better, right? You're using less stuff. And that is on some level true. But take power as a microcosm of the problems that we have. If everyone has to generate their own power and store it, that's actually really inefficient. And storage in particular of power is very complicated. Batteries are economically, ecologically, and human rightsly expensive to make, you know? And they don't last forever. There's no battery that there's weird certain kinds of salt batteries and things that we've come up with that don't degrade, but they are not efficient enough to run anything that we do. And people are working on solutions like this. Like there's kind of a neat one, right? Where if you take your electricity because it's like, well, you have electricity when the sun's out, if you have solar, but you have to put it somewhere. And so if all of the grid that we all live on was solar, we'd be kind of screwed, And there's like interesting solutions where people are like, well, what if we use the power when we have it to move a whole lot of water up into a tower? And then once the sun goes down, we let that water come back out and all that stored energy can power turbines and do stuff. So people are like working on this, but overall, you're not going to want to do that at a home level. And we actually can live lighter on the land and lighter on the earth in higher density. And I love living in nature. And so I hate admitting this, but city life in many ways is more ecologically sustainable than, everyone having 5 acres and reproducing every single element of life. Like where I live, probably everyone needs a table saw. Probably we shouldn't live in a world where everybody needs a table saw, And now if we were all like, we lived in a more communal lifestyle or whatever, not necessarily like everyone's up in your business, but if it was like everyone on my street could have 2 table saws, if we were all just friends, I only use my table saw every like 3rd day,
Well, is there a happy in between?
Ooh, I think that we could find out ways, because it's more like that there isn't an answer that is currently available, but we could develop answers, and people are working on developing answers. And it's kind of ironic because like the suburbs, for example, are sort of the worst of both worlds right now, because they are, you still have to deal with like your neighbors and noise, and then you have to deal with an HOA, and like, so you don't have like the freedom of rural life, but you don't have the like communityness of city life. And it's like this like atomized society. But the concept of the suburbs, it's actually kind of a nice population density. And, if you're like, and there are some places where it's like, well, everyone has their little single family home, but then they get together and have their like block party all the time and everyone knows each other. And, and there's actually some city living, I think actually that does this really well, of where people have block parties and things and build community. And then it's just like some of it's also going to be personal preference. There's never a like, everyone should live in high rise buildings. I would die probably if that was what was my future forever. No, it's not true. I would figure it out. I would adapt, but I very much like that there's more birds than people where I live, but I'm a weird hermit.
What made you, I feel like maybe you kind of answered this, but I wanted to address it specifically. In your videos, you brought up the struggles of off-grid life, but then you also brought up the things you liked about it. But what exactly motivated you to go do it, to say yes to it?
So I actually kind of went the opposite way of most people. I mean, besides, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up middle class in the suburbs. And then I dropped out of college because I wanted to overthrow the government and hop freight trains. And, it was the style at the time. And I wasn't very good at either of those things, or I didn't, but I did hop some trains and I did protest some things, but I didn't overthrow the government, as people are probably aware. And maybe in an alternate timeline, maybe everything's worse there. Who knows? Revolution doesn't have the best track record.
It's possible, but yeah.
And so I spent my 20s living out of a backpack, and then it didn't feel sustainable. I got my shit together. I got a minivan. I then got a regular van, and then that wasn't sustainable. So for a brief moment, I like lived rurally on grid, but that house fell through and I moved on to this off-grid project. And so it was mostly stepping up. I think that people like tiny homes when they used to live in vans. And I think people like vans when they used to live out of a backpack and on rooftops, So And then whether or not I would go backwards now, I mean, I would if I had to, you know, but I don't really want to, you know. The thing I would want to do now is live on grid and rurally, and then slowly have more and more intentional community around me where I live, you know. But I guess in subways, I guess the thing that brought me into it then, the honest answer is subculture and community. There was like a rural punk subculture of people who build shacks and tiny houses and build out their trailers and park them in tall grass somewhere and get sad about ticks, you know. And it's actually kind of a nice way to live. You know, I complain about it, right? Because I get tired of people romanticizing it super hard. But I do like it more than, and I do think it is more fulfilling than atomized, you know, office space jobs life. You know, I didn't want that. I grew up in the 90s, and I was like looking at, you know, Office Space came out when I was in high school probably, and I like had an office job when I was in high school. I like fixed computers, and I was like, I don't want to become this. I want something more interesting. So I guess I had that same kind of middle class dropout instinct that so many people have, where they're like, I want adventure, and then adventure's hard, and then I was like, I want a little comfort.
Is the world dying?
Okay, it's always dying and it's always being reborn, but we are currently in a stage where that is a little more dramatic than usual. It's actually currently, we're not like at a mass human death in the way that many people have experienced in the past. The 1940s in Europe, and in China, the 1940s, you know, Black Plague, a million other plagues, the genocide of indigenous people in North America. You know, there's been like worse times to be a human that is alive, right? Where social worlds have ended. I don't know that humans have been alive during this level of ecological crisis, because we did it, you know. But the Earth has had worse ecological crises in the past. They've caused mass die-offs and fundamentally changed everything about our ecosphere. I do believe that that is our future. I try not to tell people the sky is falling, you know, but it certainly might be. And whether that means by 2080, whether that means by 2032 is kind of remains to be seen. And everything is, of course, a scale, you know, like I'm in a massive heat dome right now. It's not hotter outside than it ever was for me in the 90s when I was a kid, you know? But it's hotter at this time of year, and it's going on a little longer. And, you know, and I live in one of the most ecologically resistant, Appalachia is very ecologically resistant to climate change, you know? And it's like, there's the whole, like the apocalypse is here. It's just not evenly distributed, because like India's in trouble. There's all kinds of places that are in trouble right now with heat. India has the highest population density as relates to, like, India is the most populous country on earth. And if you look at maps of where there are places where it is actually physically impossible to be a human outside and stay alive, India's kicking ass at being inhospitable, you know, and that's not India's fault. Like, that is the Western civilization's fault. And so, depending on where you are, yeah, you know, but then it gets complicated, right? Because you're like, well, you know, I've talked with some friends who, for example, survived the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, and they're like, well, most people survive the end of their way of life. And I try to remember that. But when I look at species extinction and stuff like that, and ecosystems changing, like winter is supposed to end every year, not for good, you know?
Yeah.
And I actually think that that's the greatest thing for us to address and confront anyone who's alive right now, is that stuff. And I think most of what we distract ourselves are actually very useful and good things that we should distract ourselves, like stopping genocides and colonialism and capitalism and things, right? And these things that tie into it all. Absolutely. But on some level, I think people have a little bit given up. They're like, well, I can't do anything about that, you know? And I don't always know what to tell them.
Well, and I know there's some speculation here, but if you had to speculate, would you say it's going to be 2032 or 2080?
I think it would be
Which one's
2032.
close? 2032.
So like, I remember like 2010 or so, I was like really on this kick where I was like, hey, climate change is a really big deal, everyone. And everyone's like, yeah, totally. Yeah, our like grandkids are in trouble. And I'm like, I think we're in trouble, you know? And all of my pessimistic levels of predictions, which came out of like reading scientific literature, reading pop analyses, you know, scientific journals aimed at the public. You know, I'm not sitting there reading the actual data reports or whatever. I'm reading the analyses of these reports. You know, but by reading all that stuff, I just had a sense of like, oh, they don't want us to freak out. So they're like kind of hedging what they say. And all of my pessimistic levels of how bad things will be at what rate have come true. Not in terms of like, actually, I've been wrong about like social collapse and fascism and crises of a political nature. Those are bad and getting worse in the United States, right? But like, you know, Trump's first term did not cause fascism in the United States. You know, who knows what the second term will be? But ecologically, yeah, I think we're in serious trouble. I think that people should be getting prepared. I think that people should be working with their community. People ask me what my advice to beginning writers is, and I say having 3 weeks of food and water in your basement to, you know, and it's like, because actually I think people misunderstand because of the way we watch apocalyptic literature, films and stuff. We tend to think like, oh, the end of everything is going to be like an off switch one day, you know? Mm-hmm. And this comes out of, it makes sense. Apocalyptic literature in the modern sense developed during the Cold War. The main threat model in the Cold War was nuclear war, which is kind of an off switch for everything, right? What we're experiencing now is what I think will keep happening, which is that natural disasters are going to get worse and worse, and that our infrastructure is going to, in some ways, we'll build up parts of it to be more resilient, but overall, I don't have a lot of faith in us, and especially here in the United States. And crises will continue to deepen and become more common. And so building resiliency to those crises, I think, is what matters.
What about adaptation? Do you think that's going to play a role?
Like us evolving to be better at heat, or you mean like us figuring out how to like grow more food underground and, you know,
a little bit of everything, like just different ways of adaptation, like ways of, you know, utilizing everything from technology, which I'm not implying technology is going to just bail us out like some people think, but I think it has a seat at the table. Totally. Also, just, you know, restructuring the way we do things. I mean, is there some bandwidth for all that, do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think we are starting to do that. We will continue to do that. It's like there are smart people working on these problems, and there's smart people working on these problems sometimes in the government and sometimes not in the government, and sometimes at some companies and sometimes not at some companies. I have even less faith in companies than I do in government, and, you know, I don't have a lot of faith in government. But I do have faith in, like, it's like I have a friend who works at OSHA, right? And, you know, and I'm not like, oh, you're the government, you're bad. And like, no, you work on workplace safety, you know? And like, she's an expert about workplace safety. And I have another friend who's like in kind of academic worlds working on some level of like agricultural resiliency to climate change, and is like studies what methods of feeding large populations cause the most ecological damage. Right. And like, I have a lot of faith in her. I think that she does incredibly important work. She can't do it alone. She doesn't do it alone. We are starting to put more energy and money into looking at different types of solutions. I think, and I could be wrong, I think we would essentially need to have some kind of revolution in order for actual changes to be able to go through. I don't think that capitalism will solve these problems in a way that helps anyone but like the Elon Musks of the world and the people closest to them, because there's no profit motive in it at the end of the day, you know? And so I think under capitalism, we're going to see more and more. Some people live in adapted areas where, I mean, even stuff like, for example, like if you replace concrete with trees in cities, the temperature goes down like 5 to 10 degrees in that city, you know? And people know this, and they study this, and they work on policy plans about how to try and make those changes happen. And sometimes they start happening. You have some places in the world, I think Australia, it's been a while since I read this, where you can't build new buildings that don't include rainwater collection, you know? And so there are ways that people are starting to say, what does resilient infrastructure look like? How do we build it? How do we live in a hotter world successfully? And it could be that we eke it through with the current system, you know, the kind of thing people have been wrong about a lot in history. You know, I just finished researching George Orwell for my podcast, and during World War II, he was part of the Home Guard. He was too sick to fight in the front, and so he was part of the Home Guard in case England got invaded by the Nazis. And he and several other socialists wanted to turn the Home Guard into a socialist army to overthrow capitalism, but kind of in this like democratic socialist way where it wasn't necessarily like, you know, running up on the whatever they had instead of a White House with guns. And he claimed we need to beat Hitler in order to have socialism, and we also need to have socialism in order to beat Hitler. He was clearly wrong. They did successfully, like capitalist imperialist Britain did successfully pull it out and stop Hitler, you know? So I try not to be, I think, okay, one of the other problems about all this like sky is falling stuff is a really good place for grifters, right? Because everyone's kind of afraid. And so you get people more afraid and then you sell them a solution. And that solution can be buy buckets of beans and rice from me, or that solution can be sign up to my ideological position and go be cannon fodder in the revolution that I tell you we need. And we are watching this happen on the right wing. We're watching, you know, and I think we'll see it more and more. I'm worried about the like flip where the author Neil Stevenson wrote about it, and he has a word for it. And I can't remember what it is, where there's going to be a point where the right wing suddenly believes in climate change and uses it to install more fascist things. Right. And there's going to be a tipping point where that happens. And I think that's probably true. I don't know. Well, I'm completely off what you were saying. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I mean, well, eco-fash has been around in various capacities throughout history. So, I don't think that's an unrealistic notion at all.
Yeah.
It's another reason to stay up at night now.
I know. I'm glad everyone's paying attention to Project 2025. But there was the recent John Oliver episode about Project 2025 and like all the like fascist stuff that Trump will probably try and do with his next term, you know? And I'm like, I kind of knew a lot of that stuff, and I'm like, oh, I didn't need another reason to stay up at night. Cool.
Do you think he's going to win?
Yeah.
I think
I could be wrong. It's the kind of, again, you know, it's the kind of thing that everyone's always wrong about. But
well, it's also
I think
so
unless
early.
One of them dies a natural death between now and the election, which could happen, they're both old as shit, but it'd have to be a natural death. If someone like killed one of them, then probably the far right will get in, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I just think in the times we're living in, especially electorally, it's almost pointless to make a prediction until mid-September, really.
Yeah, totally.
You know, I mean, I think if the election happened right now, as of the recording of this, which is June as we're recording this, I do think Trump would win, but mid-September, I don't know.
You're right, because it's like, because I'm not saying anything anyone doesn't know. Biden nuked his support with the progressive left and does not understand that the youth is wildly progressive. He's still the old Democratic Party. The young Democrats and liberals are far more progressive, tend to be critical of capitalism. But like at the end of the day, it's like Biden's still living in the like, yes, liberal. That means the capitalist party, you know? And like, and his support for the genocide in Gaza is just like probably cost him the election. But maybe like once the media cycle, I'm proud of the like at least the social media cycle not really moving on from the genocide, but it's like as the election comes up, maybe everyone will be like, oh, we yelled at him a lot, but he's our guy, and I'm not mad at anyone about any decision they make about that kind of thing, because it makes sense to be disgusted with what's happening, and it also makes sense to say, I don't want Trump to have another term in office,
Yeah, they twist people's arms. That's how it works. I mean, what are you going to do? Especially since
Totally.
I think when it comes to Gaza, I think Trump would do the exact same thing.
Totally.
So, yeah. It's where do you find your hope?
Where do I find my hope? Mostly in people. I actually, I find it in a couple places. I find it in people. I find it in community. I find it in mutual aid. I find it at like the beginning of COVID, where mutual aid just blew up across the country because people were like, oh, the government isn't taking care of us. What does it look like to take care of each other? And every time I read about in history, like when you have collapse, you have people getting together and working together. And there's this concept in disaster studies called elite panic, which is basically the sort of academic word for the people who actually freak out and do horrible things during crisis are actually the elites, the rich, the people who have something to lose, the people who had political power who want to hold on to it. You can look at this like really easily in Katrina, where like by and large, most affected communities got together to take care of each other. And whereas white militias went around and started killing black people, and then the state, well, the cops kind of were in a lot of those white militias, and then the state just like tripped on its own feet over and over again and sort of didn't care, right? And many people involved in the state did care. And you actually see National Guardsmen being like, whoops, this was supposed to go to the Red Cross, but I brought it to you anarchists instead because it actually goes where it's going, And so I believe in people rather than institutions. And then I believe in the horizontal organizations that people build during crises. I also believe I also get a lot of hope out of the fact that I know it's kind of like spiritual or woo, but it's like matter is not created or destroyed. I will one day die. That was guaranteed no matter what, right? Everyone who is currently alive I promise you that you're going to die. They're not going to pull out immortality at the last minute, I know that people are going for it, but they are not going to succeed. That's how I feel. And I have an awful lot of history to back me up. But yeah,
100% track record there.
Yeah, exactly. People and so die. I read about people like fighting and dying in like, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or peasant revolts or, these movements that lose, right? And I'm like, yeah, you know what happened to everyone else who didn't fight in those movements? They died. Everyone dies. And remembering my mortality helps me because I'm like, well, now it just comes up to how do I want to live? And I would like to live a very long time, but that is not the measure of what a good life is, and it can't be because we all know people who've died too young, I know this kid that died and it was this like sea change moment for me where I was like, I can't say that his life was too short because it was complete. It had a beginning and a middle and an end, and it wasn't where we thought it would be, and so that is true on a larger scale. We're watching species die, and nothing breaks my heart like watching extinction, And so when we're looking at guaranteed extinction, we also have to remember that almost every species that's ever existed has gone extinct, and like everything cycles. So that's death is a weird answer to where do you find hope, but like, and I'm not like, I'm absolutely like, I would love for them to like cure cancer while I'm alive. And I'd love to live 170 and like, cause I love history and I want to be part of it and see it all happen, but I'm not. So that's true. What now,
So, in closing, what projects do you have coming up that you'd like to mention? And please tell everyone where they can go to learn more about you.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a podcast called Cool People Did Cool Stuff. It comes out every Monday and Wednesday. It's usually the same topic every week. Monday and Wednesday are both the same topic any given week. And it's a history podcast. And then I have a Live Like the World is Dying podcast. And I haven't been doing YouTube as much, and I want to get back into it. It's been a matter of time. It's just a matter of, I do too many different things. I have a feminist black metal band called Feminazgul, if that sounds up anyone's alley. I've been trying to kind of get off social media, but I'm still on social media. I'm Margaret Killjoy on Instagram, Magpie Killjoy on Twitter, and I have a Substack. That's my main thing I do right now. Besides the podcasting, is I write an essay every week, and all the sort of important theory, and this is how I think the world works, and my analysis of whatever, including like prepper content and stuff like that. All that's free. And then every other week is for paid subscribers only, and it's the more personal stuff. It's like my reflections on off-grid life and things like that. And yeah, you can do those things. Oh, and I have a book coming out. I have a bunch of books, but if you're curious more about anarchism, actually, I have a book called A Country of Ghosts. It's an anarchist utopian novella that has been published by a couple different publishers. It might even, if you're listening and you read a different language, it's been translated into a bunch of different languages. And then I have a book coming out on September 24th from Feminist Press called The Sapling Cage. And it's my debut novel. I've written a ton of books, but it's my first one that's technically a novel because there's like weird pedantic differences, and it is currently being Kickstarted, but probably not anymore by the time you're listening to it. But you can probably either pre-order it or order it. And it is about a young trans girl who runs off to become a witch and has to save the world, and by community and magic and care and fun. And it's a young adult book, but it's a don't call me young adult book, which is it's called Crossover, which is young adult for people, but by publishers who acknowledge that mostly adults are going to read it, and it's really fun. I think people will enjoy it. It's the first book in a series. A bunch of authors have already read it and said they like it, so you don't have to take my word for it. You could take Cory Doctorow's word for it, or
nice.
Robert Evans's word for it.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for doing this. I've been a fan of yours for a while. I'm so glad we finally got to connect.
Yeah, I feel bad that it was kind of me just like ranting the whole time, but hopefully people got something out of it.
That was Margaret Killjoy. Yeah, check out all of her stuff. Her podcast, Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff, is amazing, as is her video series, Live Like the World is Dying. Music for the 1000 podcast is provided by Andrew Saxon. Be sure to check out his podcast, the Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can do so over at patreon.com/RonPlacone. For a Give What You Can level, you get all kinds of exclusive perks, full stand-up sets, exclusive invitations to screenings and other events concerning my films, and I'll make you a theme song, and that's all for a Give What You Can level. We got a really cool community going, patreon.com/RonPlacone. All right, 42. Itching closer to 45, which is another, I guess, monumental number. Eventually, we're going to pass up the amount of U.S. presidents. That's the next milestone number. Soon, we're going to be past the amount of U.S. presidents that have happened. And that's interesting since November's coming up. There you go. All right. Catch you next week. Peace. Hey guys, Ron Placone here. Take your own 1,000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1,000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1,000 is doing for me, and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1,000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1,000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.